Yes, so very cheesy title for my talk. So what am I going to talk about? So I'll tell you a little bit about who I am, a little bit about my background, and then what I do, and largely that will be about the research I do. And a lot of that is around friction. So we're going to have some activities. We've got a few things here. You may have seen them before. Hopefully we're going to try and explain what happens with these happens, which is probably something you won't have heard about before. And then we'll have a little demonstration at the back with the pendulum device, which is a friction measuring tool that's used on floor surfaces and road surfaces typically. We use it within our research as well. So as Dr. Harris said, I work at the University of Sheffield. So I'm based in the nice building on Mappin Street. I teach sometimes in the Diamond building. And this is the new Heart Space that's opened. Has anybody seen the glass roof behind Mappin Street? It's very nice inside. Go and have a look around. Yes, at last.
Wow.
Only took about 2 years longer than it should have done, and I don't know how many £1 million over budget, but well, it is nice. So, and we've got a couple of new labs in there at the end where the photograph has been taken from. So hopefully it will all be worth it. My office is right in the third building back at Mappin Street, in the original building on the site, which looks like it hasn't been decorated since it was built in about 1900. So this all looks nice and shiny and new, but the bits at the back aren't all quite as nice. So I did a mechanical engineering degree. I did it at Sheffield. So I came to Sheffield as a student in 1992, and I haven't left yet. So it's a great place, so I didn't really want to go anywhere. I keep telling people I haven't really decided what I want to do yet, which is why I'm still at university. I still have this nice idea that I might suddenly decide to change career and do something different. Maybe past that point now. So I'm a chartered mechanical engineer, and this is where I started. I know this is where most engineers probably come from. So when they go for UCAS visits and interviews, everybody says they play with Lego. Well, I did. I've still got this set. And we even have Lego in the department now. So there are lots of different definitions of what an engineer may be. This one I looked up. I know the IMechE, which is like the big institution in London that all mechanical engineers are meant to belong to, they did a survey a few years ago of people in the UK, and they said, who's the most famous engineer in the UK at the moment? So if you were asked that question, what would you say? Who do you think the most famous engineer is? Do you even know any? Do people actually say that? Hmm? Yeah, we'll say alive, because the person who won the vote is alive. Do you think of anybody? So we're not very good at promoting ourselves, are we? Yeah, I've met him. Yes. I'm not very impressed with his vacuum cleaners. I really said Hoover's there. I shouldn't say that, should I? But yes. So, well, yeah, at least he designs things, takes out lots of patents. No, the person who won the vote is the Kevin, the mechanic on Coronation Street, which was absolutely awful, but yeah. So clearly people don't really recognise what engineers do. So these are all the things that engineers might work on. I chose these examples because these are actually all things that I've worked on. So obviously the more traditional things that people think engineers do: cars, aeroplanes, trains, but also we do lots of stuff related to people. So a lot of the work I do is related to humans. So I have done work on teeth cleaning and replacement joints, and even shaving. So it's a very diverse subject, mechanical engineering. Actually, in our department at the moment, we've got physicists, chemists, and biologists employed. So it's getting very, very interdisciplinary. So it doesn't matter necessarily, even if you don't do an engineering degree, you can still end up working in engineering. So what do I do at work? Well, I do teaching. Most of the teaching I do is around design. See me in action there. I do also talk about teach my research area as well, but I'll tell you a bit more about that in a second. So we do like doing lots of hands-on stuff in design. So we get you making stuff and testing it. But what I really came to talk about was the research I do. So my research is all on the subject of tribology. Has anybody heard of tribology before? Good. One person. Pretty rubbish at selling that word as well. So essentially tribology is the study of what happens between two interfaces when they're loaded together and they're sliding. So that covers friction. It's when you're sliding two things against each other, you'll inevitably get friction and they may wear out. There's lots of work trying to reduce wear, so that's what lubricants are used for. So it's quite again, it's a very multidisciplinary field, and lots of different topics going on within it. So yeah, that was my attempt to show friction in action. I think you know enough about that. But this is perhaps the really critical bit. What's going on right at the interface? So all surfaces, however smooth they appear, are actually rough. So here's my rough surface. So you've got lots of little asperities. So when you look at them under the microscope, this is what you see. So you've got something 3 microns by 50 microns, so 1,000 microns in a millimetre. So that's very tiny. So these asperities are very, very small, but they're big enough that when you load two surfaces together, they can stop the surfaces moving as easily as they might do otherwise. So you get these lumps or asperities do a number of things when you bring a surface together. They might actually stick to each other, so you have some adhesion going on. So when you try and pull them apart, there's a little bit of adhesive force there, but that also stops them sliding against each other so easily. But also what happens is that they actually, when you try and move the surfaces, they kind of lock together, so you can't pull the surfaces over each other. So essentially that's the very simple level friction mechanisms. When you have different materials in contact, you can sometimes get different things happening. I'll explain a little bit more about that when we get to some of the examples I've got later on. So as I mentioned earlier, sometimes we want high friction, and sometimes we want low. Can you think of any situations where we might want high friction? Walking, yeah, that's a very good one. It's been a bit tricky recently with the ice and snow. So when else might we want high? Sorry? Yes. So yeah, we want what's the key bit that's operating when the plane's landing in relation to the wheels? Brakes. Yes. So we want good friction between the tyre and the runway. The same applies to cars, obviously, but also brakes. I did do some work on aeroplane wheels once. It was all to do with the rims. So we tested the rim material, because the rim material has to be able to travel a certain distance down the runway without breaking up if the tyre bursts. I think what we found worried me. So essentially they don't really last very long. That's one of the downsides of being an engineer. Finding out how everything breaks might make you a bit worried about travelling in like a car, a train, an aeroplane. So yes, so brakes, we've got the aeroplane landing gear. So I do lots of work on railways. Obviously the same applies on railways, but in autumn another problem arises, that's leaves on the line. So normally during the year you don't get any problems with braking or traction. Traction is also a big problem with railways. So the reason the timetables slip is because the trains have trouble pulling away from stations, and then of course they have trouble stopping at the other end. So you get drivers driving very cautiously to try and avoid that happening. We found a solution to that problem, which I'll tell you about later. Sometimes though we want to have low friction. So within a car engine we want to, for example, reduce friction as much as possible, because the more friction there is, the more energy is consumed in overcoming that, and the less efficient a car engine is. And you only need to make a very tiny amount of difference in one engine for it to be worthwhile doing, because if you think about how many millions of cars there are, if you scale that up, then that's a big energy saving. And of course, one of the problems at the moment is most lubricants are based on mineral oil, so that's not very good. So some of the work we're doing in this area is on biolubricants, using plant-based lubricants, which is quite interesting. That though causes problems, because if you start to grow crops for creating lubricants, that causes problems with growing enough food for people to eat. So you have to find balances all the time. And so other examples, just because I went to watch the ice hockey recently. So there's a huge amount of tribology in sport. The last time I gave this talk, the Winter Olympics was on, and we were going through all the different examples. So curling's quite interesting. It's, what ice does when it's loaded is fascinating. So the reason ice skates work is because underneath the blade, you're kind of locally melting the ice and getting a film of lubricant. I think you're probably well beyond the age of fidget spinners. That's a good example of tribology in action. Number of bearings in there, rollable bearings.
To get them to spin longer, don't you try to remove the lubricant from it? Like spray like WD-40 bearings.
Well,
skateboarders do.
yes.
Your bearing's going to wear out, but
yeah, I should have put a Strybeck curve in. So that there is obviously a relationship between the friction in a bearing like this when you've got a lubricant and the viscosity of the lubricant. Do you all know what viscosity is? Good. So as you decrease as you increase viscosity at a certain point, you start to get friction increase, because you've got viscous shear in the lubricant, and that may be what they're trying to do. Because if the bearing's packed with grease, that's not so good. It stops the bearings wearing out quite so quickly, but doesn't necessarily give you the lowest friction.
This is sorry.
No, that's fine. No.
Bearings. Get a new round bar bottom bracket now, which generally get full of dirt, filth. So they've got some kind of plastic almost matrix that's separating bearings, preventing ingress of grease and dirt. But then is that also a lubricant?
I guess, sometimes you will use plastic. You can use plastics in journal bearings, so you've just got surfaces sliding, a ring of plastic in there. It won't be as low as a roller bearing by a long way, but it'll be a lot cheaper.
Bottom bracket, yes.
No. I was thinking about that the other day actually, because I am terrible with my car and my bike. So I'm an engineer and a tribologist. I replace the oil in my car as little as possible, so only once a year for sure, because I'm pretty sure that's all you need to do. But my mountain bike I got in 1996, and I've probably never maintained it. So I've never replaced any bearings in it, and I've never put any grease in them, and they all still work fine. So I'm sure that won't be the case for everybody. So when we're talking about friction, we kind of define a friction coefficient, and this is the kind of thing you'd probably find in a textbook. So you can look up friction coefficients for different surfaces sliding against each other. I'd be a little bit wary about taking information like that you find, because the friction coefficient isn't just related to the two surfaces or the two surface materials. It's also heavily related to how rough they are. And of course it doesn't really give you that information there. So if in the future you're ever designing something and you need a friction coefficient, it's much better to go and measure your own. There are lots of different ways to do that. So the friction coefficient essentially relates the amount of downwards force you have on a surface and then the friction force you've got to overcome to move something. So normally when you start to move something, the friction coefficient is a little bit higher than when it's moving. So you'll see static coefficients of friction defined and dynamic. Typically dynamic's a little bit lower. Not the case with all materials. With most of them that's the case. So I should have said we were coming to this. So having rolling elements is a really useful way of reducing friction. And if you go way back in time and you look at how Stonehenge is a good example. How did people a long time ago move really big heavy things? Well, they used to have rolling elements. They may have been logs or other things like that. So they could push the big blocks of stone, for example, along with much lower friction than you'd have if you didn't have the rolling elements. So sometimes these are lubricated and sometimes not, depends where they're used. Obviously there's a big push generally at the moment to reduce the amount of lubricant being used because lots of it's made from mineral oil. So then we can need to look at other solutions to reduce wear in the bearings. That might be through surface coatings that are slippy, or other solutions. So I saw somebody talk about this recently when they were trying to look at the difference between rolling friction and sliding friction. So pushing a car is quite a good example. So if you have the handbrake off on a car and the wheels can roll, obviously it's a lot easier to push it. So I did a little calculation here, and I reckon with 3 people pushing 800 newtons each, and the car weighs 1200 kilograms, then you can work out the friction coefficient, and it comes out at about 0.2. Then imagine that somebody put the handbrake on, probably you'd need about 9 to 12 people to push the car now, unless it's snowing in Sheffield and you're going downhill, then it's like no people. And if you do the redo the sums, then the friction coefficient comes out at about 0.6 to 0.8, so many times higher. Now the friction between a car and the road is actually used in accident investigation. So when the police turn up and there's been an accident, they will actually potentially look at the skid marks, and from the skid marks and the length of the skid mark, they can work out how fast the car was travelling. I don't particularly want to go through all the maths, but you can see the friction coefficient appearing here. So you're looking at the kinetic energy of the car. So this is where you can work out the speed. So you can you can calculate the work done in the sliding during the skid. And if you know that, then you can work out the kinetic energy, and from that the velocity. And of course that relies on you knowing the friction coefficient, because it's an input to this calculation. So obviously the police need to know what the friction coefficient is between the tyre and the road for different conditions. Obviously most accidents will probably occur in conditions where the roads are perhaps a little more slippy, so there might be wet, there might be oil on the road. So they actually have a table of friction coefficients for different conditions. Of course though, you have to measure those in the first place, so how might you do that? Well, I'll come to that in a second, because the same device which we've got at the back is also used for measuring friction between shoe and floor surfaces. So the health and safety executive use that when they're investigating accidents where people have slipped over at work, for example. And rather a lot of those happen each year. So somebody mentioned shoes were important earlier. Yes, most importantly where your heel hits the floor when you're walking. Can't see that when I'm doing a heel strike. And then when you're pushing off as well. So there's about 10,000 major injuries a year from slips. What causes the problems though? Well, if you do a quick search on the internet, you find that the chips are not very good, and also grapes. So they're very profitable. I don't recommend you go out and try this though. Yeah, so somebody slipped on a chip, got £55,000, but grapes even better, £1.1 million. So when you go into a supermarket next, if you go where the soft fruit is, you'll find sticky pad things on the floor with slightly rough surfaces, so that people don't slip over near the grapes. Because what people do is tend to open the grapes up, start eating them, then spill them, and then people could slip over on them. Oh, there we go. Tesco shopper ordered after slipping on grapes inside the store. So I thought what we'd do is actually try this out and work out what's slippier, a chip or a grape, using our pendulum device. So I've come equipped with chips from Crosspool, the best, not Crosspool, Crosspool, yes. They're the best chips around. So here's our pendulum rig. So before you go and look at it, just have it's a very simple device. It's essentially a swinging arm with a head on the end, and on the head is a rubber pad, just about to see it there. Slightly angled, so as the head swings round, got an edge of the rubber pad, strikes the ground and slides along it. And obviously as it's doing that, it's losing energy. So as it swings up on the other side, there's a scale and it moves an arm. So the higher the friction, the more energy it loses and the less it moves the arm. Like I said, this is used by the health and safety executive measuring friction where accidents have happened in workplaces, between a shoe and a floor surface, but also on road surfaces in accident investigations. And actually, when obviously there is safety flooring is used, this is probably a safety floor. So when the manufacturers of this kind of floor have to show by testing with devices like this that the friction is above a certain level, that's largely done in wet conditions. That's when people are more likely to slip. So these devices are used in a whole range of different applications.
If it doesn't strike the ground, I'm a biologist, sorry. It's still not going to reach all the way to the top, is it?
No. There'll be some energy loss due to friction in the bearing there, probably.
Okay.
And maybe a bit of aerodynamic friction as well. So it won't swing all the way to the top.
So do you do a control first? Or do you just go straight in and measure them?
If you were doing this for real, so obviously the HSE, when they turn up and do an investigation, the results of that investigation may end up being used in court. So they have to use an extremely rigorous process. So they have a new pad. What they do is, first of all, is put down a bit of abrasive paper, and they do a number of swings to wear the pad in. And that has to be done the same number of swings for each incident. Then they'd remove that abrasive paper, and then they'd put it into position where they wanted to do the measurement. And they do maybe 10 swings, is it, I think, in the standard. So there are standards published saying how you should do this. And you have to set it up as well so that the pad is contacting over 128 millimetres of floor, because for that length they have a useful equation that can convert the score on the scale to a friction coefficient. So if you do it over the wrong distance, or you use an old pad where it's perhaps worn a little bit more and you have a bigger contact area, it can give you the wrong value very quickly. Right, so
let's do it. I just assume it was stuff as easy now. I want to see it in action.
It is actually spring-loaded. So
I'll take a little move out of the way. Wait, I see, yeah, good.
Yeah.
I've been on this before, and I didn't know his name, but he knows. So what's your name? Billy.
Right, come on. So we'll pretend that we've set it up properly, like the health and safety executive. And here's the scale. So there's obviously a device, a little mechanism that holds the arm in place. And we'll press that now. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So you can just do a direct comparison.
Yeah, so there are floor surfaces now.
Come on, get one of these guys to read it, because this is what they have to do. Come on.
This kind of thing you do in labs. So
Surely.
since I was at school, I can't.
Anyone want to read off that? Because it's a strange scale, isn't it? You've got this kind of... What's going on there? 16. What does he mean? What does he mean? I mean, it's 61, isn't it? But like, what do those little things mean?
You have to stop it before it hits the second time.
100 over 0.1?
I have no idea. That's what I was
Oh, okay.
So we have to we do 10 swings obviously to
Yeah.
get
Come on,
statistically
someone get a pen
relevant
and write
results.
him on the board. There you go. Well done, James. You read off, James write him on.
So do you guys get taught statistics and how you should do lots of repeats for your experiments?
Mm-hmm. Do a lot of repeats. Do you do statistical analysis in your engineering and your physics? Or do you just mainly?
Judging by what my students seem to do, I'm guessing not.
Right.
We don't teach statistics, I think. It's taught in maths.
In biology we do chi-squared, swimmer's rank and student T.
Yeah, I mean there's loads and loads of different ways of analysing this stuff.
So the values one actually.
What?
Yes. Friction coefficient.
Oh right.
Oh, is that what that is?
Yeah.
The second scale.
Yeah, the second scale.
Oh, I see.
Well, we actually like recording.
Just write down the numbers. So
Yeah.
61 is the right number.
Yeah.
What was the second?
This is without chip or grade.
Without chip or grade.
Yeah, it does.
So you call that that's normally
Control.
the
Control.
pendulums. Yeah. Okay. You want to do it again?
Yeah.
We'll do each three.
Alright, if somebody else wants to come and do it. Somebody else wants to come and do it?
Come on, who's going to pull the
You
lead?
have to
It's
press the
all
button, that's
fully
it.
risk assessed.
Yeah.
Cool.
So
You're the
press
risk
this.
assessment.
Come on, Emma.
That's it.
Press the button. Don't put your foot
Yeah,
in the
no,
way
put
of
your
it.
foot there.
Sounds on that.
Yeah, just
Yeah,
press
ready?
it. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
It even looks like a foot.
It does.
So that scale of the...
It's kind of mimicking.
Is that exactly what it's for? Right?
Well, no, I think it was used on roads first,
Yeah.
but very quickly picked
Is that
up
61?
roads.
Yeah.
And do you get larger versions?
No.
No.
There are different devices, there's a whole
Yeah.
range of different devices for doing this, but I think this is the easy.
Sorry? Oh,
Yeah.
so it's here actually. There's
But
a
yeah,
number
I think,
here.
because there's a nice equation,
Yeah.
I was trying not to put too much maths into
Yeah,
this.
So it's basically, this one.
Yeah.
It comes and hits it where it sees that point, and then where it is stopping, that's the friction coefficient.
So there's an interesting point about the friction coefficient. There's this so some people think one is the maximum it can be, but actually it isn't, particularly for materials like rubber. You can go way over one. So it means that the force you need to push something can be several times higher than the force being pushed down onto it. Right,
Cool, one more?
one more.
Alright, come on. Who's the next? Just have to press the
Come on, guys.
It'll be more fun when
Come on,
seriously
Richard.
break.
Come on. Isn't this going to kick the chip across the room? I'd love to see how
It's worked before. The first time we did this, we had no idea whether it was going to work.
Yeah, yeah.
We turned them and put them
Yeah.
down, unfortunately.
It actually squeeges it and goes for it.
Yeah, it's the same.
They're very repeatable.
Should we move it to different parts of the floor?
Yeah, we can.
Because obviously you're going to move it to different parts of the floor, because otherwise it's just going to be great floor.
Yeah, we're going to wipe it off with water and so we can.
That will
But that's also okay. We have to clean more floor.
clean as a week. Just, you see what that makes sense, isn't it? Just to chat to different parts of the floor.
Alright, level 3. Oh,
You're going to do chip or grade.
Right. Can I take a photograph as well? You know that? So how's that?
Yeah.
So you really want to be in it? James, you're always with it, aren't you?
So who?
Come on, we'll be alright.
How many of you think that grapes will be sleepy?
don't go over the money.
I'm going great. This is more lubricant.
Yeah.
Yeah, but chip's got grease on it.
Yeah, no, so we're now comparing with examples.
So we've got one, two for grade? No? So we've got 1, 2, 2 for grade? Any more?
Depends whether it's a crush grape or is it?
Oh, we are going to crush them.
We're going to crush it. Otherwise it's just going to...
Yeah,
definitely great.
Yeah, so we've
Definitely great.
got 2.
Okay, so 1, 2, 3.
Great. We got 2 for grade.
So 4, we have got 4 now.
Education going into it.
Grapes as well. So
Yes. 6 for grapes.
Oh,
This is amazing.
You said grapes? Grapes. Okay, 6 grapes. Okay, so
Do you know the answer, or is it different every time?
it's different. Yeah.
We know what one, I remember, actually no, I don't.
Yeah,
So it wasn't the same answer every time we did it
Yeah.
before, but
Because it
one
was
average
self-assessed.
was lower.
Depends on the floor set. This is
It will do, yeah.
Yeah.
It's also like it's not.
assuming everybody else
There might be somebody who thinks it's going to be the same.
Am I allowed to get you?
Yeah, and then microwave it.
You'll look at the camera.
slow motion.
Yes.
Oh, so easy.
Right,
Yeah, it's 12 hours.
Okay,
is
so
that the extent
Is that
of
very
Yes.
well, just like
Right.
what we can do? So we can forget.
We just go squeeze.
it's somewhat hairless grating, that isn't it? I mean,
There's a guy on the Cracker Jack who used to say...
crushing grape, isn't it? Yeah.
That's the wrong example.
These guys.
Alright.
Don't even know like aliens references here.
matrix reference? No.
Yeah, we're doing it?
Who's going to press it? I'm going to stand over here.
You should do it, so you should.
Come back to the button. Come on, Shane. Come on. It's like when it's a university interview.
That's the
This is as hard as it gets in university.
Oh, look at that. I mean, it's almost accelerated it to the top.
It's almost 10. 10.
I didn't think you would get there without a...
You know?
Well, I've got some paper towel here. I'm just saying.
Yeah, we have got it here as well.
Yeah, this is better.
No, no, no,
I
no.
think it's not good anymore at all.
Alright, next one. Drinks.
Need a break.
Go on, go on.
Right.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, you moved it.
Yeah, because I had to, sorry. We have to do it. That's it.
What's that about?
Yeah.
Right, go on.
Okay, sorry. Because it slipped, so.
Is that not higher or lower?
That is
High.
Height, but like.
So the angle is,
the
yeah.
lower the score, the lower the friction.
Yeah.
So when you've got stuff there in between the surfaces, you're going to get more variability.
So those numbers where are they just arbitrary units for you to compare, or is it?
You can take them and convert them to friction if you've done it over 128 millimetres. So somebody at some point.
Okay,
Which surfaces use as a reference point to get all the friction constants?
next.
Which surfaces use as a
Okay.
So that abrasive paper I talked about, there's like a number you have to achieve when you're doing that swing with your abrasive paper. So that's, if you're getting the wrong answer there, then you have to either change the contact
So it's
length
like
or use another rubber pad.
25 or 20? What can you read? 25? 25. Yeah.
Okay, right, we're going to go chip.
Yes, the team.
Yeah, why did you rubber? If you drop it and it doesn't touch,
Yeah, then it will just swing it. I mean, it will go to zero, yeah.
it will get to
Yeah,
zero.
because when it touches, then only the numbers.
Zero is not, so that's swinging right through
yes.
the equivalent.
So it wouldn't reach that,
So
but
this is the friction
yeah.
loss and the
I see.
You might have to change the surface.
kind of move it over here.
Move it forward a little bit. Is that actually slightly angled? Is that?
Yeah, it's probably not going to read.
Oh, okay.
This is quite an old.
Sorry.
Actually, you can adjust the feet. I've never seen anyone, like, after an accident get one of these out there and test the, Does it? Maybe I'm not very
We've worked with the health and safety executive, so I guess we see more
Right.
on my side of things.
There's no way chips are going to beat grapes. Really? Chips have got the easiest slime. It's easy.
You don't use it.
I thought you did. It used to.
Last night.
Yeah.
The real question here is how long is the one
That we did before.
Yeah, yeah.
Alright.
We get some vegetable on there, so I just put that. Because you're not getting high grease. Fresh. We'll get some outside.
Probably would be different if they were
Yeah, exactly.
Should we try them cold and then
Okay. Alright, chips.
It's variety.
Went for chips. Oh, you went for chips at all?
To do chips?
Yeah.
Or are you going to catch it?
Yeah.
Right, that's it.
So it's less than 60, so around 55.
That's very close to this.
Yeah. Or do you want to heat it up?
It was fresh chips.
Yeah.
Much lower.
Yes, yes, yeah.
What if you just got like chips and
No, the oil is
that
not.
is
Yeah, but the oil is not.
it's pretty
Free with no oil.
It's not the result you're hoping for, is it?
I believe it's just iron about as well. There's nothing at all.
It's absolutely fine.
Okay.
It's a lot worse.
So it's the next one.
It's not clean.
James will do it.
Yeah.
You've done it.
Everything's slightly
There you go, Greece. Ooh, that was it.
You're right.
Really?
Wait.
Really fresh? No, give it back.
Like to be fresher.
Just a rosin.
Oh, so I might be
You say
This basket of this goes. This is you have a tube. You have a tube. And you have a
Oh no. I'll do this.
okay.
Seven.
We'll see what the warm ones do.
Yeah, I know.
I'll go get a
Yes.
No, it must not.
Who's going to clean the chips today? You guys? Yes.
Yeah, so we got whitewash.
Not all of those things would make it very simple. Very easy. Right.
Is that the new spread?
The bottom of it's like
The dust cone brush is a bit like, lots of where chemicals
yeah, so then you like die because you got ridiculous. This is science.
hang on to this. The warm chips smell lovely, don't they? Well up for that. Oh. Does that mean that's increase the lubrication of the oil fat?
Yeah.
It like releases all fats, doesn't it? It's just all water.
Yeah, oil water is special.
You can feel
This is science in action.
There's an EPQ here, guys. The slipperiness of chips depending upon the temperature.
If we've been offered them.
And that way.
Okay, James, keep the top out of them.
No, we're too late to keep it down there.
Good. Right, come in.
Grapes window.
Grapes still win.
Yeah.
We haven't microwaved the grapes either. To make it complete the right soup. So I'll sort this out. Got to give this guy a rush back as well. There'll be a great sense of irony if someone walks in this door and slips on this chip. Oh, you've done an assessment? Oh, brilliant.
And there's not tomorrow when somebody walks in.
Oh, yeah.
That's for what we're using the tester for.
Look at that. That's done a better job.
Okay, so
What if you just slip on one for like
75.
Right. You remember what the
58.2. Are you doing
we could have done that.
The difference between 25 and 10 is the same.
There you go, so grapes. Whatever.
That's why I'm drinking grapes.
Be very careful.
They need more intervention.
Oh, that's a good point.
There's always carpet though, you're right, by the fruit section in Tesco. Carpety thing. I was just literally have to mop up all the leakages from the refrigeration things.
We come back down this end as well. Carry on.
Should we sit back down and face this way, guys?
Right. So we're going to move Raman. You might have to come and demo when because we're the wrong side of the camera. So we've got some more demonstrations. So we've seen slippy floors and what might happen if a road's slippy. So we're going to look at a couple of other examples now. We're falling apart. So I've got two telephone directories here. We've basically interleaved them. Sure. I might have to do this quickly before they fall apart. So, do you think we'll be able to pull these apart? No. Has anybody seen this demonstrated? There's a clip on TV of two other things being used to try and pull
I'd
these
say
apart.
you should be able to pull them apart, but I'm probably not going to be able to.
No, well, I won't pull really hard because there's no point. So, no is the answer. And if you stick a transit van at either end of this, it's still no.
How many pages have you got into these?
Oh, I don't know. Probably. It must be a few hundred at least, maybe more. So yeah, two trucks can't pull that apart. I'm sure if you look it up on YouTube, you'll find a video. I think it's on Blue Peter. So yeah, can we pull? And I've got another example. So can we pick this up without touching the bottle? Has anybody seen this? It's rice in a bottle. No? So you've seen the telephone actually. So if I stick that in a little way, nothing's happening. If I stick it in all the way, so why does this work?
Friction. Some of many small frictions added together.
Yes, essentially that's exactly it. So if you had a couple of sheets of paper, well, you could slide them over each other really easily. And one rice grain in contact with something, almost negligible friction force. But if you add it up over the hundreds or thousands of little interfaces, the further you push that in, and of course the further you push it in, the higher the normal force as well, because you're packing the rice grains up a bit more. So you're increasing the force, the normal force, and you've got more contacts and there's more friction force as well to pick it up. And it's exactly the same with the sheets of paper. So one, nothing, even a few, that's no good. Hundreds of thousands, yeah, you've got enough resistive force there that you can't pull it apart. Which is essentially what I've said there. I'm sure there are other applications where this is relevant. I have actually done work on a rice sorting machine. Actually, I've done work on a rice processing machine as well. You would not believe the amount of energy that goes into turning healthy brown rice into white rice. So you have at the start of the process, there's 2 wheels with rubber on. They're rotating, separated by a small gap. One's going slightly faster, so you get some shear in there, and the rice is fed through with its husks on. That dehusks it. Well, that rubber wears out really quickly because rice husk is very abrasive, so that's one problem. Then the rice grains go through abraders essentially, and there's like a veined shaft in the middle of this device rotating, and there's a mesh around the outside, and got air flowing through. The rice comes in, the veins sort of make it rotate as it flows through, and it hits the mesh at the outside, and you get the healthy brown stuff gets abraded off. But abrasion, that means it's wearing the rice out, but also the metal at the outside as well. And then right at the end of the process, the rice goes down a whole series of chutes. So you've got a single line of grain in each chute, and at the bottom, each grain of rice is optically inspected. And if it's out of shape, there's a little air jet that blows a puff of air and puts it into another bin. But all of the chute wears out, because it's the same problem. Each rice grain doesn't really create a measurable amount of wear, but these machines operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in India and China, where they do most of the rice processing, so they wear out very quickly. That wasn't meant to be in the talk, but a little there. So I'll say this tribology is literally everywhere, which is good. Means I have lots of work to do. I thought we'd move on to a few examples now. So we've done some work in the past for Gilberts who make rugby balls. We've also done work on footballs, goalkeeping gloves. Has anybody heard of golf, the frisbee golf?
Yeah.
The people who make the soles of these shoes also make the frisbees for golf, and you get each frisbee is slightly different material to do a different shot. We did some work measuring skin friction or finger friction between the hand and the frisbee to make sure you spin it correctly. But yeah, this was perhaps more interesting. We didn't get to speak to him. Does everybody know who he is? Do you see him on the TV now talking about it? We watched him play and win the World Cup a long time ago. He was a kicker though. Kickers have a bit of a vested interest in what goes on the surface of the ball. So I'll pass this around. It's got pimples on it, which is what we were looking at. I'll come back to why the kickers are sensitive about the pimples in a bit. So these are all the different patterns that have appeared on the balls over the year. Every time there's a big competition, new ball comes out, new pimple pattern. No science behind the pimple pattern at all. It's all a bit marketing driven. But you can see here there's quite a lot of variety there. So you've got quite big pimples there, closely packed. Here they're kind of hemispherical.
triangular ones here, or a bit pyramid mixtures, ones that are more spaced out. I guess people may have tried to intuitively work out what would give better grip. Rugby balls are kind of an interesting example because sometimes you want really good grip when you're trying to catch the ball or run with it. When you're trying to manipulate it or pass it or do something else with it, you may want slightly lower friction. Does anybody here play that?
Long time ago.
Yes, so this is our self-defined unit of megapimples per metre squared. One of the first things we did was look at people handling rugby balls. These are not. So here we've got dry ball, here we've got wet ball. So this is a high-speed video camera. It's quite interesting to see what the fingers do. You kind of subconsciously move your fingers around when you're trying to grip something to find the optimum position. And of course it doesn't work at all with a wet ball. I think that had no pimples on it at all. We did have a completely smooth one, which is how rugby balls used to be. Made of leather, they were just smooth. These are not professional players by any means. They were just people hanging around the lab at the wrong time. So we did some measurements, a very simple rig. We have a rugby ball surface on a flat plane, and it's got load cells underneath, so we can measure the normal force of pushing down with and the friction force, and we just drag our finger across. So that's how we're measuring normal force and friction force. So we've done it for three different balls here. So the lines that are higher up are the ones with the better friction coefficient. So you can see there large round pimples in dry conditions came out very well. The other two were fairly similar. Eventually though, at really high forces, they're all the same. This kind of breaks all the friction laws, Amundsen's, which I'm not going to go into that. But yeah, with viscoelastic materials like skin or rubber, you get completely different behaviour to when you put two bits of steel together. So why is that? So if we look at a finger on the closely packed pimples versus the ones that are more spaced out, what can you immediately see? What's the big difference between the two there?
The contact points.
Yes, so we've got much bigger contact area on the ones that are closely packed. So here, friction with these materials, skin and the rubbery material of the ball, friction is very much affected by contact area. Of course, when you push down hard enough, your skin deforms around the pimples such that the contact area is pretty similar. So that's why it kind of levels off. No matter how much harder you push down, you can't keep increasing the contact area. So what happens in the wet? So here, for the large round pimples that are closely packed together, actually friction is lower in the wet. But for the small round pimples, it's pretty much the same. So why do you think that is?
Water. It fills the gaps.
Yes, so it's a bit like car tyres. So very oversimplified, but with the large round pimples, there's probably enough space for the water to go so it can film a lubricating film, whereas with the ones that are spaced out, there's somewhere for it to go. So that's how car tyres are meant to work, if they're not really worn out. So you've got some contact still there. And this is quite good. This is what you want from a ball. You want the same kind of friction, whatever the conditions you're playing, whether it's wet or dry. And that isn't just about rain. It can be sweaty hands. That's a good question, actually. I don't know anything in about that. So if your hands are slightly damp, do you think friction gets higher or lower from a dry state? No. Actually gets higher initially. And that's because your skin absorbs the moisture and becomes more compliant, so you get a bigger area of contact. So slightly damp hands are quite good for friction. So you imagine when you're leafing through lots of bits of paper, which you might do when you're marking stuff,
Yeah.
you quite often will find yourself licking your finger as you get higher friction and you've got a licked finger when you drive. So that's one example of some work we've done. We've done lots of other things with fingers. This and there. So I'll show you this little video. This is something that Raman spent how long working on? 3 years? not just on this video. But. So what do you think that is? Any ideas?
Source finger go across.
Yeah, exactly right. Not many people get that, so that's good.
What sort of imaging are you using for that?
It's optical coherence tomography.
That one.
It's actually an advert at the moment. It's the eye advert. There's an advert on the TV where somebody's in space holding an OCT machine, because opticians are now using it for looking inside eyes to diagnose problems with eyes. But we've used it really. So these are individual finger ridges, and we've kind of made a surface slightly rough, and we can see how they're deforming. So we can work out exactly what the real contact area is between the skin and the surface. Because obviously nominal area is really easy to work out, but the ridges on your finger pad create a different contact area. So this is becoming more important well, it's important in a whole load of areas, but now of course we've got touch screens.
How does that work, that image though? The imaging itself.
How does it work, right?
So
This
it's
is
a
why I brought
laser
it.
which passes through a transparent film, so it goes like that and takes an image. It's taking a
Right.
image like
But
that.
it penetrates.
So you're looking
penetrates
at,
the
so you're
skin as
looking
well,
at
doesn't it?
a section.
Yeah,
Yeah.
section of
Yeah.
Bit
It
like
goes down.
confocal microscopy layers.
Yeah. It goes down. How many? There's only a few microns, isn't it?
what's that?
How deep does it go into?
It's around 1.5 millimeters.
1.5. No. You can't get much deep. You need to go deeper. You need to use ultrasound.
So you move your finger across the surface like that,
Yes.
and then it's shining.
Yeah,
across
the
it.
image is like
Okay.
Well, what we tend to do is, because it's hard to move the OCT.
from below.
Yeah. So we tend to move the surface in between so the
Okay.
finger stays still,
I see.
and then we move the surface,
Yes.
and then we'll measure friction at the same time.
This has been measured
typically.
from top. So we're doing like that.
Oh, whoops. That's not what I want to do. So we do an awful lot of work on human tribology. So we're mechanical engineers, but we do work with people a lot. And just to move away from that completely, we've developed a new way to treat leaves on the lawn. And we were testing this over the autumn in 5 different places in the UK. And this is, we do it using cryogenic material, so dry ice essentially. So it's just to show that we do actually not just mess around in the lab, we do get outside of the lab and make some impact. So the dry ice comes in the form of pellets. So this is carbon, it's basically compressed carbon dioxide. So we can fire the pellets at the surface. And obviously they have some kinetic energy when they hit the surface, but also very cold. So they about -70 degrees centigrade. So they freeze the contaminant on the railhead, obviously making it brittle. So you've got kinetic energy of the pellets then hitting a brittle contaminant, break it up. But the particles, as soon as they're out of the nozzle and they hit the surface, they sublime or they turn back into gas. And they do that in a tiny fraction of a second. There's like an 800% increase in volume in that tiny fraction of a second. So you've got these little air explosions all over the railhead. And they can remove the contaminant.
Is that obviously what all the science you described is going to make that better than like sandblasting it, but
Well,
sandblasting where the rails are.
the sand is used on board trains. Most trains have a sanding unit on, and that fires sand pellets or sand particles into the wheel rail interface as the train's braking or when it's pulling away from a station. We have trialled dry ice to do that, and it does it better. We've tested that on a train, but separately Network Rail Clean Track, so they have railhead treatment trains. You see them in Sheffield Station sometimes, like 2 locomotives, a load of water wagons, and then a unit in the middle with a big pump that blasts the water up the track. or we could replace all that with one vehicle to do our cleaning. So we trialled it at Supertram. They've got a road to rail vehicle. So this has got some separate wheels inside. You drive over the track and they engage with the rail. And I've got a video of that in operation, so you can see how it works.
That's quite impressive. And did that idea for using dry ice, did that come out of your lab, or were other people looking at it?
That was all my idea actually.
Really?
For once. Yeah, we were using it for something completely. Oh, in it again. How do I? Oh.
You do it on my
Just
laptop.
push it.
Well, no, it's working. I've just.
Yeah, no, just drag it to the screen.
Maybe the other way.
New
Windows
supplement.
P generally swaps it around if you want to.
It's a new laptop. I'm used to it.
We can probably just see it anyway.
Let's better get it on the screen. Sure.
Get on the screen.
So this is the button function or?
Oh yeah.
Oh.
Extend or duplicate.
Oh yeah. Duplicate.
Oh, whoops. Ah.
Yeah.
There we go. Here we come. Yeah, some time. There we go.
Right, I'll try again. Like that. Lost the sound, but it is very noisy, so well there. So these are the wheels that come down and engage the track, and they're two nozzles for the dry ice.
Now, has that got, have you patented all this and everything?
No, it's because dry ice is used for cleaning already. Okay, there's lots of know-how in there, though.
Yeah.
So whenever we do this for people, we don't tell them exactly how we've done it, how we're applying the.
Yeah.
So this is basically wet, slightly rusty rail. So you can see the clean band emerging from all the muck.
Yeah.
So this was something we did the autumn 2018, and that persuaded Network Rail to get us onto 5 bits of essentially live track to do cleaning with them. And next year we've been asked to clean the whole of the West Highland line in Scotland. I don't know how we're going to do that because we're not really a service provider.
How much
in that
dry
way.
ice does it require to do that?
It's not very much actually.
Not?
It's maybe a few kilograms per mile. And if we wanted to, we could put a pelletizer on there with liquid CO2 and actually make the pellets as we're going along. What we need to do is improve the science so we can extract CO2 from the air, compress it, and that's probably a
Funny big thing for a locomotive, that'd be amazing.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm going to do that quickly. And the air that's coming out is going at supersonic speed, which does help as well. So that kind of deals with water quite effectively, but you need the dry ice to deal with leaf layers and rust. So we've trialled this on leaf layers. This year there were virtually no leaf layers because there's so much heavy rain. Most of the leaves that cause a problem are not necessarily the ones that fall directly on the rail, it's the ones by the track. So the aerodynamics of a train is such that as it goes past, it basically sucks leaves into the wheel rail contact. So that's how so if the leaves are by the track are really sodden, they don't move, so there are no leaf layers. Of course, there was also lots of flooding as well, so that kind of helped to wash it all away. So yeah, that's some of the. Do I need to do the same again now to get it back?
Yeah. You can do Alt Tab directly with the presentation.
There we go.
Oops.
Right.
Let's see.
So right, we did clean a bit of the West Highland line. Thanks for coming.
All right. I think someone might need to get going because it's getting close to bus time. But we're almost done, I'm sure, aren't we?
Yeah.
Sorry, thank you.
The silency bit. I'll just took a
It's
little bit around the last
yeah,
bit,
yeah, yeah.
just because we've railway line to cells, so we've done the outside of humans. We also do the inside of humans as well, and that's some more work that Rowan's been doing. So we're looking in particular at the interaction of a catheter which gets inserted into a blood vessel. So we've been looking at...
Is that to like reduce the damage it causes to the
Yeah.
endothelial cells? Or like?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So Roman's been culturing endothelial cells on a combination of layers meant to mimic the structure of a blood vessel. Here you can see the cells. This is just a simple indentation, so we've pushed a ball down onto the cells. The red, we've kind of dyed them and imaged them. So the red ones are dead, the blue ones are alive. So you're getting some very interesting effects because you'd expect the whole lot to die as you load them, but the geometry of the ball is such that the ones in the middle are only being normally loaded, whereas these ones, due to the shape of the ball, have got a little bit of shear, and that little bit of shear is enough to kill the cells, which is quite interesting. We've also then run the ball along the surface of the cells. You can see here now, look at the levels of friction, coefficient of friction we're getting now. It's like order of magnitude lower than all the other things I've been showing you. So very, very low friction, but still at those levels of friction you can get damage to the endothelial cells. So we've imaged along the track. You can see, well, areas of cells are removed and ones are more killed off where you've got higher friction. We've been speculating as to why those cells have been killed off in those places. Yeah, so we look across the scales, the railway line right down to human cells.
And do you collaborate with people in like the bioscience departments in MBB for that sort of thing, or is they just all in the house?
No, we do it.
You do all these-
We can do everything better than anybody else, obviously. No, we do. We are working. I mean, the Faculty of Engineering is so interdisciplinary now.
So
we have all the people in-house.
You do tissue culture and stuff.
Yeah, so there's a big group, the Insignio group, that are basically working towards modelling the human body. Now they're based across the whole university, but there's a lot of people in mechanical engineering who work in that group, and materials as well. So yeah, like tissue engineering group in materials, we work with them, looking at tribology of engineered tissue. So, yeah.
Just because we used to work with a cardiovascular disease research group, and they were looking at essentially the resistance of blood flow over the top of endothelial cells and how that changes gene expression. So we have branches in blood vessels, you have like turbulence,
Yes.
and that changes how those endothelial cells will behave.
Yeah. Yeah, we haven't got as far as putting we have media there, but we haven't put blood in as such. That may be a step too far, I'm not sure.
Yeah,
So that
the
is
gene
the
expression. So that's brilliant.
It is
Yeah,
the
love
end
it.
of it.